When I reached the old gate, its rusted hinges groaned as if reluctant to see me again. Inside, strangers carried pieces of my life out in cardboard boxes, my mother's porcelain vase, the coat rack my father built, the faded rug I learned to walk on. Their laughter was hollow, their hands careless. In the midst of it stood my brother, leaning against the doorway like a man who'd just finished a job well done. One look at the tilt of his head, the smug calm in his eyes, and I knew this wasn't some tragic mistake. Every box that passed me was another confession, his betrayal written in ink I didn't need to read. The hallways smelled the same, faint traces of sandalwood and old paper, but the air was heavy, as if it knew it was being emptied. My fingers brushed the wall where my height had been marked in pencil years ago, but the marks were painted over now, hidden under a glossy coat that wasn't ours. He walked beside me, his voice too light, saying things meant to soothe. I barely listened. His words didn't match the way he kept glancing at the movers, counting each item as if they were coins in his pocket. Every memory in that house felt like it was slipping between my fingers. Stolen while I was standing there watching. He greeted me with that familiar half-smile. The one people mistake for warmth until they notice it doesn't reach his eyes. His handshake was firm, but there was no brother in it, just a transaction. A deal he'd already decided I was on the losing end of. The excuses came rehearsed. It was for the best. We needed to act fast. You weren't here. The words were polished, but the greed underneath was as old as him. The same hunger that once made him pocket my lunch money when we were kids. He didn't even bother pretending this was about anyone but himself. The papers lay on the kitchen counter, a legal stamp in the corner like a signature from a stranger. The ink had dried days ago, maybe weeks. My name wasn't anywhere on them. The house was already gone, sold before I'd even stepped foot on the porch. He had stripped it from me quietly, without warning, like someone closing a door in the middle of a sentence. It was final, irreversible. He said my name then, softer, as though that would make it hurt less. It didn't. Anger would have been too easy. It would have given him something to push back against. Instead, I let silence stretch between us until it felt sharp enough to cut. I met his eyes with a calm so still it was almost unnatural. His voice faltered. He didn't know it, but that was the moment something shifted. His advantage began. Too thin, thread by thread. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't argue. I would let him believe he'd won. For now, behind that calm, my mind began working, measuring every weakness he didn't know I'd seen over the years. The debts he thought no one remembered. The friends he kept to close out of fear, not loyalty. The bills he paid late. The favors he owed but never admitted to. Each detail slid into place, like pieces of a lock I would one day open. It wasn't revenge yet. It was groundwork. When I stepped past him toward the door, I smiled, not the way you smile at family, but the way you smile at someone whose fate you've already decided. He didn't flinch, not yet, but he would. That smile was the first thing I gave him that he couldn't sell, couldn't box up, couldn't make disappear. One day, when the walls closed in on him and the debts came calling, he would remember it, and he'd know that this was where it began. The house stood at the end of the lane, a little worn at the edges but holding the weight of decades inside its bones. Its walls still remembered our childhood muffled footsteps on cold mornings, the clink of our mother's teacups, the way my father's laughter could fill a room. Every corner carried a piece of us, pieces my parents had worked themselves, thin to preserve. It wasn't just a house. It was the last, tangible proof that we had once been a family. Losing it wasn't an inconvenience. It was the theft of a lifetime. On paper, it was supposed to be safe. My parents' will had been clear. Joint ownership between my brother and me, so neither of us could make a move without the other's consent. But the fine print, the vague legal phrases and clever clauses was a door left ajar. And my brother had always been the kind to see an unlocked door as an invitation. Somewhere in that language, he had found his loophole, and I knew he was already sliding through it. Looking back, the signs had been there. The temporary loans he swore he'd pay back, but never did. The heirlooms that went missing only to appear later in someone else's living room. The way he'd smile when caught, as if charm could erase theft. He'd been rehearsing for this for years. This was just the biggest stage he'd ever found. Then came the little slips. A comment over dinner about liquidating assets. A hushed call, one overheard, his voice just low enough to suggest I wasn't supposed to hear. At the time, they seemed disconnected, but threads have a way of knotting together when you're looking for them. I started to see the outline of something I didn't yet understand, but I knew it wasn't in my favor. The first real crack came in the form of a document legal paper with my name signed in neat, practiced strokes. Except I had never signed it. My brother's signature had always been shaky, almost shy. But the one at the bottom of the page mimicked mine with unsettling precision. Whoever forged it had done their homework. At the county office, I didn't need to explain. The clerk took one glance at the file, and her expression said more than she could politely voice. This wasn't just a trick, it was a plan. One that had been in motion long before I realized I was standing in its path. She didn't have to tell me the rest. The property had already moved through the system like water through a sieve, fast, deliberate, unstoppable. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand. I didn't write memories. I wrote moves. His weaknesses, his allies, the debts he'd never paid, the people who owed me favors and still picked up the phone when I called. I wasn't thinking about saving the house anymore. I was thinking about taking everything he thought was untouchable. By the time he smiled across the room at me again, thinking the deal was sealed, I had already set my first piece in motion. He believed it was over, that the ink on his fraudulent sale marked the end of my claim. What he didn't know was that for me, it was just the first step in a longer, sharper game, one I had every intention of winning. The documents smelled faintly of fresh ink, as if they'd been signed only hours before. I let my fingers drift over the pages, tracing each line not for the legal jargon but for the things he hadn't meant for me to see, dates that didn't match his story. Initials in unfamiliar handwriting, and side notes that hinted at meetings he'd never mentioned. Names appeared more than once in places they shouldn't have, as though the same shadows had been lingering around our family's business for months. He thought I'd skim and toss them aside. Instead, I read every word until the patterns began to speak for themselves. The buyer's name was little more than a signature at the bottom, but paired with the number scrawled in the margin, it became the first loose thread in the weave of his deception. A polite phone call later, I had the voice of a stranger confirming they'd been in contact with my brother long before the sale, that the deal had been discussed in hushed tones while I was conveniently kept away. It wasn't anger I felt, it was a sharpening clarity. Neighbors can be unreliable witnesses, but the ones on our street had seen enough to fill in the gaps. Behind lace curtains and front porches, they recalled rushed visits from suited men, late-night truckloads moving boxes that should have stayed in the house, and my brother lingering outside in whispered conferences. Every account was another nail in the coffin of his plausible deniability. The more I heard, the more I realized this had never been impulsive. It was a long game, played in the shadows, and he'd counted on me being too far away to notice. Looking back, the signs were obvious. The urgent trips that never lined up with any real emergencies. The calls he'd step outside to take when our parents were still alive. The subtle ways he'd dismissed my concerns, making me feel overcautious or paranoid. All those moments I'd shrugged off now clicked together like puzzle pieces. I wasn't looking at random betrayals anymore. I was looking at a career of them, and then I found the crack he'd tried hardest to hide. Debt. Not the kind a man can smooth over with charm, but the kind that sends collectors to your door. He hadn't sold the house to profit, he'd sold it to survive. Without that sale, the people he owed wouldn't be asking politely. They'd be taking. His need for quick money was the single weakness I could use to pull everything apart. Didn't need to take him on alone. Old friends-in-law, former colleagues who'd seen enough of his arrogance to welcome the chance to undercut him. Even the new owner of the house, each became a piece on my board. I made sure none of them knew the full scope of my plan. That way, they could never tip him off even if they wanted to. When I invited him to coffee, I kept my expression easy, my voice light. We spoke of family, of the weather, of nothing that mattered. He thought it meant I had moved on, that I was extending some fragile olive branch. The sugar in my tone was deliberate. People rarely guard against what they think they've already won. The weeks that followed were quiet to the untrained eye. I filed papers that looked routine, made calls that seemed unrelated, arranged meetings that appeared casual. But every action was aimed with care, each one setting a trap he couldn't see because it didn't look like one. By the time he began to sense something was off, the strings were already tight around him. Every choice he made was one I'd accounted for. Every contact he reached out to had already spoken to me. His next moves weren't his at all, they were mine, disguised as his own. And as I watched him dance to a rhythm he didn't know I'd written, I understood that revenge wasn't about striking back quickly. It was about pulling every thread until the whole fabric of his world came undone in his own hands. At the family gathering, his voice carried over the chatter like a brass trumpet in a quiet room. He was laughing loud, unrestrained, recounting the stroke of genius that was selling the house, spinning the betrayal as if it were simply smart business. Faces around the table wore polite smiles, but I caught the flicker in their eyes, that discomfort people feel when witnessing cruelty dressed as charm. I said nothing, only let my glass rest between my fingers, knowing that every boast he made was another rope he was tying around himself. His appetite for profit was never satisfied. Barely had the ink dried on that deal before he set his sights on another family heirloom, speaking of it casually, like it was a trinket gathering dust instead of a piece of our history. The restraint he'd once shown was gone, replaced by a reckless hunger that blinded him to the quiet watchfulness in the room. Overconfidence had replaced caution, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it handed me the final piece I needed. It came sooner than I expected, a smug offhand remark about how certain details in property filings could be adjusted to move things along. He said it to impress an acquaintance, not realizing I was listening. That single comment was the loose stitch in his entire tapestry of lies. Within days, I had the document he'd carelessly altered, the legal thread I could pull until the whole fabric unraveled. The buyer, once a distant figure in this game, became an unexpected ally. A discreet conversation and a few pointed facts were enough to shift their loyalties. They hadn't known the full story when they signed. Now they did, and they had no desire to be dragged into the legal mire he was headed toward. Their silence was gone. They were ready to speak if the time came. My files were no longer just a collection of papers, they were an arsenal. Each forged signature, each mismatched date was another nail in the coffin of his defense. I arranged them in sequence, a silent, irrefutable timeline of deceit. Even if he tried to deny one piece, the others would pin him down until he had nowhere left to turn. And creditors, always circling, always hungry, were closing in. They had waited for the sale money to disappear before pouncing, and now he was juggling threats he couldn't keep up with. Fighting me in court would mean bleeding resources he didn't have. He was already drowning. I was simply choosing when to press his head under. Still, the law alone wasn't enough. I wanted its verdict to carry my signature. I built my case so that every page, every witness, every fact was tied back to me, even if my name stayed hidden from the official record. He would know exactly who had set the gears in motion, even if no one else did. And so I waited, standing at the edge of the quicksand, watching him inch forward with that same arrogant swagger he'd worn at the family table. One more step, I thought. Just one. The ground beneath him was already softening, the weight of his own greed pulling him down. When he took it, the trap would close not with a snap, but with the slow, inevitable pull of consequences that could no longer be escaped. It took only a few words, spoken with deliberate care, to undo the deal he thought was his crowning victory. The buyer sat across from me, pen in hand, ready to commit. But when I laid out what I knew, without raising my voice, without ever asking them to act, understanding dawned in their eyes. They closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and stood. By the end of the week, the sale was nothing but a wreckage of contracts and broken promises, and he didn't yet know my fingerprints were all over the ruins. The documents he claimed were misplaced had been in my possession for weeks, not hidden, preserved. I made sure they arrived in the right hands, the ones belonging to investigators who understood the weight of altered dates and forged signatures. They didn't come in shouting or threatening. They worked in quiet precision, the kind that leaves no escape route. His name was now inked into their files. The kind of ink that doesn't fade. Every day after, his debts swelled like a tide he couldn't hold back. Collectors didn't care about pride or excuses, they wanted payment, and each visit, each call, ate away at the hours he had left. He was no longer playing to win. He was scrambling to survive, and the more he scrambled, the clearer it became that the walls weren't just closing in, they were already touching his shoulders. Then the whispers began to travel. At first, it was murmurs in living rooms, small circles exchanging knowing looks, but it spread quickly into community boards, into shops, into conversations held over coffee where his name became shorthand for deceit. It wasn't anger they carried, it was contempt, the kind that lingers far longer than outrage. Even his defenders, those who had once excused his arrogance as charm, stopped meeting his eyes. They crossed streets, turned down paths, pretended not to notice him in public. The isolation wrapped around him tighter than any legal bind could. A man who once thrived on being seen now found himself invisible where it mattered, and far too visible where it hurt. My phone lit up with his name more times than I could count. The first call, I watched until it stopped ringing. The second, I placed the phone face down. By the 10th, I didn't even check the screen. His messages ranged from desperate bargaining to rage-filled accusations, each one confirming that silence was the sharpest blade I could wield. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had sold away our history without hesitation now clung to a sale he couldn't afford to lose. This one was supposed to be his rescue, his lifeline, but the buyers had vanished. The trust was gone, and the market had turned its back. All he had left was the hollow echo of his own ambition, and the knowledge that I had never once needed to raise my voice to take it all away. The letter from the court arrived without ceremony, just another envelope in the day's mail. But inside was the quiet victory I had been waiting for. The legal default had gone through. The property, stripped from me years ago, was mine again. When I walked through the doorway, the air felt unchanged, as though the house had been holding its breath, waiting for my return. Every wall, every corner, stood untouched by the years he had spent trying to erase my claim. It wasn't triumph I felt, but restoration, something stolen, finally finding its way home. For him, there was no such restoration. His debts didn't nibble at the edges, they swallowed him whole. The same creditors he had once charmed no longer entertained his promises. Accounts froze, assets disappeared, and then came the final blow: foreclosure on the house he called his last safe place. It happened suddenly to him, but I knew it had been inevitable since the first crack appeared. Collapse, after all, never announces itself until the walls are already falling. The silence that followed wasn't the kind you choose, it was the kind that chooses you. One by one, the people who had once defended him, even loved him, withdrew. There were no more dinners, no more late-night calls of solidarity. His circle became a single point, himself, and in that echo chamber, the only voice left to hear was his own, replaying every mistake, every betrayal, until the noise turned to static and the static turned to nothing. While he unraveled, I worked. Not loudly, not with grand gestures, but with precision. Every deal closed, every project finished, was another layer of stability he could never match again. I built a life in the open while he lived in the shadow of his own making. My successes didn't need to be paraded. They spoke in their own quiet way, a language he understood well enough to know he'd never translate it back into his favor. And in the end, there was no need for final words. I didn't stand over his defeat or deliver some rehearsed speech. I simply let the silence speak for me. Because revenge, I'd learned, isn't about the moment you strike, it's about how long the echo lasts after you've walked away. And mine would outlast every storm he'd ever brought into my life.